The scent of death is a metallic sting, and right now it's the only thing keeping me awake. Silver is a quiet poison. It doesn't scream. It just simmers in the blood until your heart forgets how to beat. I dragged my heavy, ruined body through the ironwood, my claws furrowing deep, jagged trenches into the frozen earth. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass because the silver-tipped arrows in my side were dancing against my ribs. I wasn't alone in the dark beside me. The ghosts of my slaughtered pack ran through the trees, shadows of brothers and sisters who had been turned into red mist by the king's mercenaries. I could almost hear my beta's voice, a gravelly whisper in the wind, telling me to lay down. "Just a little further," I growled, the sound ripping from my throat like a dry sob. Truth be told, I was looking for a hole to die in. I was an alpha of nothing, a king of a graveyard, and the weight of my survivor's debt was heavier than the iron sky. The pain was a fire. The cold was a shroud. The silence was a lie. I was a biological weapon that had failed its only mission: protection. What followed was a sudden shift in the air beneath the smell of pine and old snow. A new scent drifted toward me, something soft, something domestic. Lavender-dried rosemary. It shouldn't have been here in the mouth of the bitter hollow. It was the smell of a home I didn't deserve, yet my body moved on instinct toward it. Before I could collapse, a vision of a silver wolf flashed before my eyes. My father, or perhaps just a dying hallucination. I reached out, my fingers trembling as the fur turned to snow. I was losing the man. The wolf was scratching at the inside of my skull, wanting to take the wheel and turn my final moments into a blind, bloody rampage. Soon after, the trees began to thin, revealing a tiny stone cottage huddled in the ravine like a secret. A single light flickered in the window. It was a beacon of everything I had lost. Still, I pushed forward, my blood staining the pristine white snow in a rhythmic, morbid trail. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the last gasp of a dying dog. As the wind shifted, the scent of the woman grew stronger, wrapping around my senses like a silk ribbon. I didn't know what scared me more: the men hunting me, or the strange, peaceful pull of that light. I watched her from the safety of the hemlocks, my golden eyes narrowed and burning with a fever that wasn't just from the silver. The woman, Elsie, though I didn't know her name then, was rhythmic. She raised the axe, and thwack, the wood split perfectly. She moved with a calm grace that felt like a personal insult to the chaos screaming inside my veins. "One snap of her neck," the wolf whispered, a dark, oily thought. "One bite, and the noise stops." I was a predator, and she was prey. But the way she hummed to herself made my hackles drop. It was a low, melodic vibration that acted like a sedative on my fractured mind. Deep down, she knew the truth. The forest was watching her, but she didn't look up. Instead, she just kept working, her cheeks flushed pink by the biting cold. As the silence stretched, I felt a strange heat bloom beneath my skin. My tattoos, the obsidian ink that recorded every sin of my pack, began to pulse with a dull amber light. They were hungry for the heat of her life. Rather than pouncing, I found myself leaning against a frozen trunk, mesmerized by the sheer mundanity of her existence. Moments later, the sky turned a bruised purple. The solstice storm was no longer a threat. It was a reality. The temperature plummeted so fast, the trees began to pop and crack like bone. My vision blurred, the edges of the world fraying into gray static. Because of the silver, my healing factor was stagnant, leaving me as vulnerable as a human. She stopped chopping and looked toward the woods. Her eyes were wide, searching the shadows where I lay hidden. In that moment, the space between us burned with an unspoken tension. She was the hearth, and I was the hollow I wanted to reach for her, to beg for the warmth she radiated. But I was an alpha's don't beg. What's worse, the wind carried a new sound from the valley below, the heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots, Silas Vane. He was coming to finish the job, his silver-tipped heart as cold as the iron he carried. I had to move. I had to hide. The woodshed was my last hope. I stumbled across the clearing. my legs feeling like leaden weights. Every heartbeat was a drum of agony. By the time I reached the rough wooden door, I could hear the shouting of men and the baying of hounds in the distance. They were close, too close. "Fenris, get up," I hissed at myself. But my human name felt foreign, a title for a ghost. I collapsed against the door, my weight forcing it to groan on its hinges. I was losing my ability to stay human. My fingernails were lengthening into claws, and my jaw ached with the urge to shift. But a full transformation in this state would kill me. Without thinking, I threw my shoulder against the wood one last time. The door gave way with a splintering crack, and I tumbled into the musk of dry cedar and old hay. It was dark, save for the slivers of moonlight peeking through the slats. I lay there, gasping, my blood cooling on the floor. Without another word, the world began to tilt. Beneath the moonlight, I saw her shadow fall across the entrance. She was standing there, a lantern in one hand and a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't scream. She didn't run for a pitchfork. Instead, she just stood there, her breath hitching in a way that made my own chest ache. "Help!" The word died before it left my lips. As the truth unraveled, she stepped into the shed. The scent of lavender hit me like a physical blow, a human anchor that suddenly tethered my drifting soul. I felt it, clear as day, the moment our fates locked. She was the first person in years who didn't look at me like a monster to be feared or a weapon to be used. To make things worse, the hounds outside let out a blood-chilling howl. They had found the trail. They knew I was here. Despite that, Elsie didn't flinch. She set the lantern down and knelt in the blood, her hands trembling, but her eyes steady. And just like that, everything changed. I felt her small, warm palm press against my forehead, and the wolf inside me didn't snarl. It whined. It lowered its head and surrendered to her touch. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I realized I wasn't just sheltering in her shed. I was being claimed by her mercy between one breath and the next. The darkness finally took me. The last thing I felt was her dragging my heavy frame toward the cottage, her voice a soft, frantic prayer in the roaring wind. I was an outlaw, a beast, and a failure. Yet, as the silence roared, I knew I was no longer alone in the dark. The transition from the freezing dark to the warmth of the hearth was like being reborn in a furnace. I woke up to the sound of a crackling fire and the sharp, clean scent of pine resin. For a second, I thought I was dead, that the mercenaries had finally sent me to the great pack in the sky. But then the pain returned, a white-hot spike in my side that reminded me I was very much still trapped in this ruined, silver-poisoned meat. Moments later, I felt something move. My eyes snapped open, glowing a fierce, predatory amber. I wasn't on the forest floor. I was on a thick wool rug in front of a fireplace. The woman, Elsie, was kneeling over me, her hands stained red with my blood. She was dragging my heavy frame closer to the heat, her face set in a mask of grim determination. "Don't touch me," I tried to snarl, but it came out as a pathetic, wet rattle. Truth be told, I wanted to rip her throat out. My instincts screamed that any human touch was a prelude to a blade, yet her hands were oddly cool against my feverish skin. She didn't flinch when my tattoos began to pulse, a rhythmic, angry gold that lit up the dim room. Instead, she just pushed a damp cloth against my brow. "You're burning up," she whispered, her voice like soft velvet over gravel as if pulled by a string. I tried to lunge. My body moved on instinct to pin her down. I wanted to show her the beast she had invited inside, but my muscles betrayed me, collapsing back onto the rug as a fresh wave of agony washed over me. I was a king of nothing, a broken alpha being handled like a wounded pup. What followed was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. She didn't run. She didn't scream for the village guards. She reached for a needle and a spool of silk thread, her eyes meeting mine with a radical empathy that felt more dangerous than silver. "I'm going to stitch the wound," she said, as if she were talking to a skittish horse. "If you bite me, I can't help you, and if I don't help you, you'll be dead by morning." the room was filled with the rhythmic tink-tink of a kettle and the soft thud of Elsie's footsteps. I lay there, watching her move through the golden haze of the firelight. She was brewing something that smelled of ginger and bone broth, a domestic dance that felt like a sedative to the wolf in my head. I couldn't remember my name. Every time I reached for Fenris, I found only a howling void of snow and teeth. I was losing the man, becoming a hollow shell filled with nothing but the survivor's debt. Still, the way she hummed, a low, wordless tune, seemed to build a wall around my mind, keeping the feral darkness at bay. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to rasp, my voice sounding like two stones grinding together. She paused, the steam from the kettle rising around her like a halo. "Because no one should die alone in the dark," she replied simply. "Not even a man with gold in his eyes." Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just her human anchor working its magic. I felt a strange shift in the air, the space between us thickening with an intensity I hadn't felt since before the massacre. She wasn't just healing my body. She was anchoring my soul to the floorboards of this tiny, safe world. In that moment, a heavy thud echoed from the front door. My body went rigid, a growl rising in my throat before I could even think. It was the sound of iron on wood, the sound of a hunter. "Elspeth Thorne!" a voice boomed from outside, cold and arrogant. "Open up! We know the beast came this way." It was Silas Vane. I could smell him through the cracks in the door. The scent of wet leather, expensive tobacco, and the suffocating stench of silver. My heart skipped a beat, then doubled its pace. If he came inside, I would have to kill him, and in doing so, I would destroy the only peace I had found in years. The tension broke when Elsie stood up, her jaw set. She looked at me, her eyes darting to the shadows beneath her heavy oak table. Without a word, she pointed, a silent command for the great beast to hide like a common cur. "Hide," she mouthed, the word hanging in the air like a prayer. I rolled behind the heavy tablecloth, my chest aching as I suppressed the heat of my tattoos. I watched from the darkness. As she unbolted the door, Silas Vane stepped in, his tall, lean frame casting a long, jagged shadow across the room. He looked around with a predatory focus, his hand resting on the hilt of a silver-etched sword. "You're late with your trade, Elspeth," Vane said, his voice a smooth, oily caress that made my fur stand on end. "And there's blood on the snow leading to your ravine." "A wolf took one of the stray goats," Elsie lied, her voice steady, though I could hear her pulse racing like a trapped bird. "I chased it off, but I'm not opening my door for a chat in a solstice storm, Silas." What's worse, Vane didn't leave. He walked toward the hearth, sniffing the air. My air, he was a witch finder for a reason. He could smell the wrongness in the room. He reached down and picked up a stray obsidian scale that had fallen from my tattoo, holding it up to the firelight. "Strange goat," Vane murmured, his eyes narrowing. "It looks like something from a nightmare." Deep down, I knew the truth. She was 1 second away from being arrested for treason. I coiled my muscles, ready to spring from the shadows and tear his heart out before he could touch her. But Elsie stepped forward, placing herself directly between the hunter and my hiding spot. "It's just a stone, Silas. Now get out before the frost locks your boots to my floor," she snapped, her radical empathy turning into a fierce, protective shield. Eventually, the hunter spat on her floor and turned to leave, but not before throwing a cold iron coin onto her table. "For your troubles," he sneered, "and a reminder we hunt monsters here. Elspeth, don't become one of them." The door slammed shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. Elsie leaned against the wood, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I crawled out from the shadows, my human form flickering as the stress of the encounter pushed me to the brink. As the silence roared, I looked at her, really looked at her. She had risked everything for a creature she didn't even know. Not only that, but she had looked a killer in the eye to save me. "Why?" I whispered, the word finally leaving my lips like a confession. She looked at me, her eyes swimming with a mix of fear and wonder. "Because you're not just a beast, are you?" Between one breath and the next, I realized I was no longer just an outlaw. I was her secret, and she was the only thing keeping the wolf from the door. The transition from being a hunted animal to a domestic secret was a strange, quiet kind of agony. Coming morning, the world was a tomb of white. I woke up not to the sound of screaming or the smell of silver, but to the rhythmic, comforting scrape-scrape of a wooden spoon against a bowl. The storm had buried the cottage, sealing us into a cocoon of stone and cedar. Still, my body remembered its violence. Every muscle cord felt like it had been replaced with rusted wire. I tried to sit up, but the room tilted. Because of the silver poisoning, my equilibrium was a shattered mirror, making even the act of breathing a conscious effort. Elsie was there in an instant, her hand firm on my shoulder, pressing me back into the furs. "Don't," she commanded. "The stitches are fresh, and the fever hasn't fully broken." I looked at her, my golden eyes scanning her face for the trap I was sure was coming. Instead, I saw only exhaustion. Not only that, but I noticed the dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept, stayed awake all night to make sure I didn't stop breathing. What's worse, I realized I was a burden, a heavy, dangerous weight in her tiny, fragile world. "I can help," I managed to rasp. I reached out, trying to take the heavy ceramic bowl of grain she was holding, wanting to prove I wasn't just a dying beast. But then, my strength flared. Between one breath and the next, my fingers tightened too much. The ceramic shattered like a dry bone, spilling the grain across the rug. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as the wolf inside me recoiled in shame. I was a weapon of destruction. I didn't know how to be gentle. Rather than scolding me, Elsie simply sighed. She reached into a cupboard and pulled out a bowl carved from heavy oak. She pressed it into my hands, her fingers lingering against mine. "Use the wood," she said softly. "It's harder to break things made of trees than things made of clay." As the silence stretched throughout the day, I watched Elsie work. She didn't treat me like an alpha or a monster. She treated me like a man who had forgotten how to live. She gave me tasks, small, boring human chores that felt like iron weights on my pride, yet they acted as a psychic sedative. I sat by the hearth, my large hands clumsy as I tried to separate dried herbs for her salves. Truth be told, it was infuriating. My soul wanted to hunt, to howl, to rip the world apart for what it had done to my pack. Yet, every time the kettle whistled or she adjusted the logs in the fire, the hearth anchor pulled me back. "Why do you stay out here?" I asked, watching her mending a torn cloak. "The village, they hate you." She paused, her needle hovering in the air. "Because out here, I don't have to pretend to be what they want," she said. Before I could speak, she pulled back her sleeve, revealing a series of faint, jagged scars that wrapped around her forearm like brambles. They weren't from an animal. They were the marks of a human's cruelty, the witch marks the villagers had given her before her mother died. In that moment, everything changed. I saw the truth. She was an outcast, just like me. Her tattoos weren't magic, but her history was written in her skin all the same. Her soul answered mine in a way that made my chest ache with a sudden, sharp longing. We were two broken things trying to build a fortress out of a one-room cottage. "We are the same," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. She looked up, and the moment our eyes locked, the air thickened. Time stood still. I saw my own reflection in her dark pupils. Not a monster, not a weapon, but a man who was finally, for the first time in years, being seen. Soon after, the honeymoon of our isolation began to crack. While Elsie was in the cellar, I stood by the frosted window, my instincts surging as the wind shifted. The air didn't smell like snow anymore. It smelled of ozone and cold, sharp metal. I walked to the door, my pulse racing. Beneath the porch steps, hidden under a pile of seasoned wood, I found it. It was a silver-tipped trap, its serrated teeth glinting in the pale winter sun. It hadn't been there yesterday, which meant someone had crept up to the house while we were inside, silent as a ghost. "Silas," I growled, the name vibrating in my throat like a death knell. Without thinking, I reached down to crush the mechanism. but the mere proximity to the silver made my tattoos flare with an agonizing heat. As fire bloomed beneath her skin inside the house, I felt her distress. The anchor was so strong now that she could feel my pain. She came rushing to the door, her face pale. "Fenris! What is it?" she cried out. I pointed to the trap. Not only that, but I showed her the direction of the tracks leading back toward Oakhaven. They weren't random, they were a perimeter. Silas Vane wasn't just hunting me. He was using Elsie as a tether. He was waiting for me to get strong enough to move, or for her to break. "He's using you," I told her, my voice low and dangerous. "He's using you as a stalker. He knows I won't leave you." In the quiet that followed, the weight of his stare felt like a physical pressure on the roof. I realized then that my presence wasn't a gift. It was a death sentence. To make things worse, a crow landed on the fence post, its black eyes watching us with a chilling, human-like intelligence. As if the forest watched, I pulled Elsie back inside and bolted the door. The world outside was turning toxic, and the sanctuary of the Bitter Hollow was shrinking by the hour I looked at her, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I had to choose, stay and risk her life, or run and lose my soul. "I won't let him take you," I vowed, my voice a rumbling promise. She gripped my hand, her touch the only thing keeping the wolf from screaming, "Then we fight," she said, "together." Between one breath and the next, the hearth anchor transformed. It wasn't a sedative anymore, it was a battle cry. The sanctuary of the cottage felt like a cage that was getting smaller with every tick of the clock. The sun was a pale, cold coin in the sky, but I didn't feel the freeze. I stood in the yard, my shirt discarded despite the biting wind because the heat in my blood was roaring. I swung the axe with a rhythmic, violent force, splitting the frozen oak logs like they were made of dry parchment. Crack, crack, crack. Every strike was a prayer to a god I didn't believe in, a way to bleed off the protective rage that was threatening to turn me into a beast. What followed was a moment of stillness. I paused, the steam rising off my bare, tattooed chest in thick white plumes, and I felt Elsie's eyes on me from the porch. She was watching the sins of the pack inked across my skin, the obsidian lines that pulsed with a faint amber light every time my heart beat. Truth be told, I wanted her to look away, yet I found myself turning toward her, exposing the scars of a king who had lost everything. "You're working yourself to the bone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. In fact, I was working to keep the bone from shifting. I was an alpha without a pack, and the energy was backing up in my veins like a dammed river I needed to provide. I needed to make sure she had enough wood to last through a siege, even if I wasn't there to burn it. Still, as she stepped off the porch and walked toward me, the air thickened. "I need to be useful," I managed to rasp, my voice vibrating with a low, primal hum. Before I could move, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against the massive tattoo of a weeping wolf on my shoulder, and just like that, everything changed. As the mark tingled, she gasped, and I felt a jolt of her own memories, the smell of old parchment, the sting of a villager's slap, and the crushing loneliness of this ravine. Her soul answered mine, and for a heartbeat, we weren't just a healer and a monster. We were a single, burning pulse in the cold moments. Later, a sound cut through our bubble of heat. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the popping of the ice. It was a low, guttural snarl that didn't come from me. From the tree line of the ironwood, 4 pairs of yellow eyes emerged. They weren't shifters. They were wild, starving timberwolves driven to madness by the great frost and the unnatural scent of an alpha on their territory. "Elsie, get behind me," I growled, my claws beginning to slide out from my fingertips. Without thinking, she tried to back away, but the lead wolf lunged. It was a blur of gray fur and hunger. Her heart skipped, and she tripped over a log, falling into the deep snow. The beast snapped its jaws inches from her throat. Fury propels me, and in that moment the human anchor snapped. I didn't just fight, I exploded. What followed was a roar that shook the very glass from the trees I didn't fully shift. The silver in my blood wouldn't allow it. But I became something in between. My tattoos erupted into blinding white fire, and my thermal radiance turned the snow around me into a cloud of scalding steam. I caught the lead wolf in midair, my strength shattering its ribs with a single squeeze. The others whimpered, their primal instincts telling them that they weren't facing a man, but the great beast of legend. Soon after, the remaining wolves fled into the dark, but the damage was done. I stood in the center of a scorched circle of grass, my chest heaving, my skin glowing like a dying star. I turned to Elsie, hoping to see relief. Instead, she was staring at me with a terror that cut deeper than any silver blade. I was a monster. I was the thing the kingdom feared, Fenris. She whispered, her voice a fragile thing in the mist. As the silence roared, I realized the cost of my protection. That roar had echoed for miles. Not only that, but the heat signature I had just released would be visible to Silas Vane's scouts from the valley floor. I had just lit a signal fire that told the world exactly where the outlaw was hiding. That night, the cottage felt like a funeral parlor. We sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire that felt pitiful compared to the heat I had released earlier. I watched Elsie out of the corner of my eye. She was shaking, her hands gripped tightly around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Deep down, I knew the truth. I had brought the war to her doorstep. "I have to leave," I said, the words tasting like ash. Vane saw that he knows. Instead of agreeing, she stood up and walked to the door. She unbolted it and pointed to the outside of the heavy wood. There, nailed into the center of the grain, was a cold iron coin. It hadn't been there when I was chopping wood. It was a warning shot. A promise that the village was no longer just watching. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. "They won't let you leave, Fenris," she said, her voice gaining a sudden fierce edge. "And they won't let me stay. If you go, they'll kill me for treason. If you stay, we both die." Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the desperate bravery of an outcast. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hide the tears in her eyes, but she didn't look away. What followed was a choice that lacked any logic. She reached out and grabbed my hand, her small fingers locking into my scarred ones, with a grip that defied the gods. "I'm not a martyr, Fenris," she whispered. "I'm just tired of being afraid. If the beast is what it takes to survive, then let them come." As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I felt the hearth anchor change again. It wasn't a sedative anymore. It was a bond of blood and iron. I looked at the cold iron coin and then back at her. She wasn't just my healer, she was my pack. And an alpha does not abandon his pack. "Then we make this house a fortress," I vowed, my voice a low, rumbling threat. But then, a distant horn sounded from the valley floor, a long, mournful note that signaled the start of the great hunt. The game had changed. The stakes were no longer just my life. They were her soul. And as the sky darkened, I knew the blood on the snow was only the beginning. The horn's echo died against the stone walls, but the vibration stayed in my teeth. The great hunt had begun. That night, the air in the cottage didn't just feel warm. It felt heavy, like the moments before a lightning strike. I stood by the hearth, my back to the room, staring into the embers. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of my pack. I saw the silver fire that had consumed them. Truth be told, I was terrified that the same fire was about to swallow the only thing I had left, the woman behind me. "Tell me," Elsie whispered. Her voice was close, right behind me. "Tell me what happened to them. Not the version the hunters tell yours." What followed was a slow unraveling. I turned, and as our eyes locked, the human anchor pulled a confession from my throat. I told her about the night of red snow. I told her how I had watched my sister fall, how my father had shifted one last time to buy me seconds of life. I told her that I lived because I ran, and that the sins of the pack on my skin were a map of my cowardice. "I am a king of ghosts, Elsie," I rasped. my chest aching as if the silver arrows were being twisted. Everyone who touches me ends up in the ground. Instead of pulling away, she stepped into my space. The heat coming off my body was enough to singe the air, but she didn't flinch. She reached up, her small hands framing my face, forcing me to look at her. In that moment, the world narrowed until there was nothing but the scent of lavender and the sound of two hearts trying to become one. "You didn't survive to be a ghost," she said, her voice a fierce, low vow. "You survived to be the fire that keeps the dark back. You are not a monster, Fenris. You are a man who was never allowed to mourn." Soon after, the intimacy turned into a desperate, simmering heat. There were no more words. There was only the frantic pull of hands on skin and the hearth anchor locking into place with a physical finality that shook my very soul. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I tasted her, a mix of salt and sweetness. And for the first time in a decade, the wolf was silent. There was only the man. Come morning, the shift in my soul was absolute. I was no longer an outlaw waiting to die. I was an alpha defending his mate. I waited until the moon was high and Elsie was asleep. Then I slipped out into the frost. My body moved on instinct, my senses sharp enough to hear a mouse's heartbeat. 3 ravines over. I found the first of Vane's traps near the stream. It was a massive iron jaw, coated in a layer of silver that made the air around it taste like rot. Because of my alpha strength, I didn't need a key. I gripped the cold metal, my tattoos glowing a defiant, blinding white, and I twisted. The iron groaned and shrieked, the mechanism shattering under my hands. What followed was a systematic destruction of the hunt. I moved through the ironwood like a vengeful spirit. Dismantling their perimeter one silver tooth at a time, I was winning the shadow war, yet my instincts were screaming, something was wrong. The air didn't smell like a hunt anymore, it smelled like a trap. I stopped near the old logging road and sniffed the wind. The scent hit me like a physical blow, burnt hair and rotting meat. A false flag Vane had slaughtered a dozen sheep and charred them to look like a beast's kill. He wasn't waiting for me to come to him. He was making sure the villagers had a reason to burn the cottage down. I raced back to the ravine, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the wind. By the time I broke through the tree line, the horizon was already glowing with a jagged line of orange light torches, dozens of them. The village was moving, spurred on by Vane's lies and their own ancient, festering fears. "Elsie!" I roared as I burst through the door. She was already awake, clutching her mother's old iron kettle like a weapon. Her world tilted as she saw the look on my face. She didn't need me to tell her. She could hear the rhythmic chant of the mob approaching the ravine. To make things worse, the wind shifted, bringing the metallic tang of Silas Vane's presence. He was leading them, his silver sword drawn and glinting in the torchlight. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling, but she didn't drop the kettle. Before I could move, a sudden, sharp whistle sliced through the air. A cold iron bolt shattered the window, grazing my shoulder and burying itself in the heavy oak table. The room filled with the smell of ozone and burnt wood. I felt it, clear as day, the moment the poison hit my system. The human anchor flickered, the wolf inside me rearing up to claw its way out. "Get in the cellar!" I commanded, my voice dropping into a guttural, terrifying register instead of hiding. She grabbed my arm, her touch the only thing keeping me from shifting right there and then. "No," she said. "If you go out there alone, they'll kill you. We hold the door, Fenris, together." But then, the front door shuddered under the blow of a battering ram. The wood groaned, and the hearth anchor between us groaned with it. I looked at her, my soul answering hers with a fatalistic roar. I knew I couldn't protect her and stay human. One of those things had to break. And as the door began to splinter, I realized that to save the woman I loved, I would have to become the monster she had tried so hard to heal. The door didn't just break. It exploded inward in a shower of splintered oak and hate. The first thing I saw was the light. Not the warm, golden glow of Elsie's hearth, but the harsh, flickering orange of 100 torches. Silas Vane stepped over the threshold, his eyes cold and empty like a winter's grave. Behind him, The villagers of Oakhaven crowded the doorway, their faces twisted into masks of mindless terror. Before I could move, a heavy silver net hissed through the air, its weighted ends wrapping around my limbs with a searing, agonizing bite. "No!" Elsie screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the mob. What followed was a coordinated strike of brutal efficiency. Vane didn't want a fair fight. He wanted a trophy. Every time I strained against the silver mesh, the metal burned deeper into my flesh, sending plumes of acrid smoke into the small room. I watched in absolute agony as two men grabbed Elsie, pinning her arms behind her back despite her frantic kicking. "Let her go!" I roared, the sound more animal than man. In fact, the more I fought, the more the silver poisoned my senses. Vane walked up to me, his boots clicking on the floorboards I had mended just days ago. He leaned down, his voice a lethal whisper that only my sharpened ears could catch. "You should have stayed in the shadows, beast. Now, you'll watch her burn for the crime of loving a monster." Soon after, a second bolt, this one solid cold iron, thudded into my thigh. The impact was like a mountain of ice crashing into my soul. Cold iron doesn't just hurt. It severes. I felt the human anchor, that beautiful, invisible cord connecting my spirit to Elsie's, snap with a sound like a breaking violin string. The lavender scent of her skin vanished, replaced by the suffocating stench of wet fur and iron. "Elsie," I gasped, but the name felt heavy, like a stone I could no longer lift. Truth be told, the man was drowning. I looked at Elsie one last time as they dragged her out into the snow, her eyes wide and pleading. She was screaming my name, but the sound was getting further away, muffled by the rising tide of the wolf's rage. I was losing the memory of her touch, the memory of the wooden bowl, and the memory of the peace we had built. "Fetch the shackles," Vane commanded, his voice echoing in the hollow shell of my mind. What's worse, I realized I was a failure. I had promised to protect her. Yet, here she was, being treated like a criminal because of my existence. The survivor's debt flared up, a black flame that consumed my last shred of human reason. If I couldn't be her man, I would be their nightmare. That night, the ironwood was a graveyard of broken trees and frozen blood. I sat alone in a ravine miles from the cottage, my body twice its human size, covered in matted fur, and the shimmering obsidian of my tattoos. I had escaped the silver nets, leaving a trail of broken bodies behind me. But I hadn't saved her. I had forgotten how. As the silence roared, I stared at my claws. I didn't know whose blood was under them. I didn't know why my chest felt like it had a hole the size of the moon. The wolf was in control now. A massive, terrifying beast of smoke and amber eyes, but even the wolf felt the cold. I had become the very thing Vane said I was. A predator without a pack. Safe. A tiny, flickering thought whispered in the back of my brain. Make her safe. But then, the thought vanished. I lowered my head to the snow and let out a howl that wasn't a call for a mate, but a funeral dirge for a soul. I had forgotten Elsie's face. I had forgotten the warmth of the hearth. I was just a beast waiting for the silver to finally reach my heart. Beneath the moonlight, the world looked like a cage of blue ice. I was ready to stay here until the frost turned me into a statue. Yet, as the wind shifted, a tiny, impossible ghost of a scent drifted over the ridge. It was faint, so faint I thought it was a trick of my dying mind. But it was there. Lavender deep down, the man stirred beneath the fur. I didn't know who she was, but my bones remembered her. I stood up, my massive frame shaking off the snow, and turned my snout toward the village. If they want a monster, I would give them one. But I was going to find that scent if I had to burn the world to do it. The transition from the animal's despair back to the man's mission was a slow, agonizing crawl through a mind made of ice. Coming morning, the world was a blur of gray and white, but the wolf's senses were sharper than any human blade. I was a mountain of fur and muscle, crouched in the frozen brush overlooking the Oakhaven Square. Truth be told, I didn't remember why I was there until I saw her. Elsie was being led toward a wooden platform, her hands bound with heavy hemp rope, her face pale but her chin held high. "The witch!" The crowd screamed, their voices a cacophony of fear that made my ears flatten against my skull. What followed was a spark in the dark. As the wind shifted, that scent, that lavender and rosemary, hit me with the force of a battering ram. My heart skipped a beat, and suddenly, the human anchor didn't just flicker. It roared back to life. I remembered the wooden bowl, I remembered the way her hair smelled by the fire. Not only that, but I remembered the promise I had made to be her protector, not her executioner. "Mine," the wolf growled. But this time, the man agreed. Before she could reach the platform, I saw her look toward the forest. In that moment, our eyes locked across the distance, and the space between us burned with a new, desperate hope. She wasn't just a victim. She was a signal fire. I saw her move her lips, whispering my name into the cold, and my soul answered with a vibration that shook the snow from the trees. Soon after, the wolf's rage transformed into a cold, calculated resolve. I wasn't just going to slaughter the village. I was going to lead them into the only trap they couldn't escape, their own fear. Rather than attacking the town square, I began to circle, my massive paws making no sound on the frozen crust I needed to pick them off, to draw the silver away from her until the path was clear. What followed was a masterclass in predatory strategy. I found the first of Vane's scouts on the ridge, a man with a silver-tipped crossbow and a heart full of greed. I didn't growl, I didn't bark, I simply became the shadow that took him one by one. I thinned their ranks, my tattoos glowing with a steady, focused amber that was no longer a sign of fever, but of a high alpha reclaiming his throne. "Where is it?" I heard Vane scream from the square, his voice cracking with a frantic, rising panic. "Find the beast! It's in the trees!" In fact, I was everywhere. I was the snap of a branch, I was the steam rising from the ravine, I was the ghost of every wolf they had ever hunted. Because of the human anchor, I could feel Elsie's heartbeat. It was a steady, rhythmic drum that guided my movements through the labyrinth of the ironwood. I was gathering my remaining strength, preparing for the final push that would either save us both or end us in a pile of silver and ash. The tension broke when Elsie did the unthinkable. As the guards turned their heads to the forest, she used a hidden piece of flint, something she must have snatched from the cottage, to saw through her ropes. She didn't run toward the safety of the village. She ran toward the glass forest, toward me. "Follow her," Vane roared. "She's leading us to the lair." That's why the race began. I saw her small figure darting through the crystalline trees, her breath coming in frantic white puffs. Behind her, Vane and a dozen of his best men followed, their silver armor clanking like funeral bells. Not only that, but they were armed with cold iron nets and heavy harpoons. They weren't just hunting a wolf anymore, they were hunting a legend. "Just a little further, Elsie," I thought, the man's voice finally dominating the wolf's roar. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I felt her terror and her triumph. She was bringing the hunt to the clearing of glass trees, the place where the wind couldn't hide a scent and the ice reflected every shadow. It was the perfect killing field. Still, she didn't stop until she reached the center of the clearing, turning to face her pursuers with nothing but her mother's courage. "Come and get me, Silas," she shouted, her voice echoing like a bell through the frozen wood. In the span of a breath, I stepped out of the shadows behind her. I was 10 feet of matted fur and glowing obsidian, a monster born of their own cruelty. But when I looked at Elsie, I didn't see prey. I saw my pack. The moment their eyes locked, the air thickened with a power that transcended the physical. I let out a call that wasn't a howl, but a summons to every ghost in the ironwood. The final push had begun, and as the sky darkened, I knew that tonight, the hunters would become the harvested. The transition from the wild, predatory fury of the hunt to the stillness of the final stand was a silence so loud it felt like it might shatter the world. The glass forest was a cathedral of ice, and we were its only congregation. I stood behind Elsie, my massive clawed shadow swallowing her small frame, as Silas Vane and his men surrounded us in a jagged circle of silver and steel. The air thickened with the smell of ozone and the heavy copper tang of my own blood. Truth be told, I wanted to lung, to turn the clearing into a red smear. But then Elsie did the impossible. She turned her back on the hunters and looked at me. "Fenris," she whispered, her voice a fragile bridge across the abyss. Before she could move, she stepped into my heat, her palms pressing against my matted, blood-stained fur. She didn't flinch at the growl vibrating in my chest. She didn't run from the monster. Instead, she looked into my amber eyes and spoke of the tea, the mending, and the wooden bowl. In that moment, the hearth anchor held with a strength that defied the gods. My body moved on instinct, but not to kill. My bones began to pop and snap, a romantic and intense transformation that felt like being carved from stone. "No!" Vane screamed, his face a mask of thwarted greed. "Fire!" What followed was a storm of silver. I shifted back to my human form in mid-air, naked and vulnerable in the snow. Yet more powerful than I had ever been as a beast, I caught the first silver harpoon with my bare hand, the metal searing my palm as my thermal radiance melted the tip into harmless lead. I wasn't a weapon anymore. I was a man who had something to live for. With a single thunderous roar of my human voice, I disarmed the front line, the sheer force of my heat shattering their frozen shields like glass. Soon after, the clearing went silent. Silas Vane stood alone, his silver sword trembling in a hand that had lost its conviction. He looked at me, then at the villagers who were lowering their bows, their eyes wide with the realization that they weren't looking at a demon, but a man who loved. As the truth unraveled, the mob turned on Vane, their ancient fears replaced by a sudden stinging shame for the cruelty they had allowed. "Get out!" I rasped, my voice thick with exhaustion and the lingering taste of the wolf. Rather than fighting, Vane fled into the dark, a coward stripped of his title and his gold. I felt the tension break, the sins of the pack on my skin finally cooling into a steady, peaceful glow. My chest ached, not from the silver but from the sheer weight of being alive. I collapsed into the snow, my strength spent, but before the cold could take me, I felt her. "I've got you," Elsie whispered, wrapping her heavy wool shawl around my shoulders. What's worse, the physical pain was a mountain, yet the relief was an ocean. We sat in the center of the glass forest, two outcasts who had survived the impossible. Not only that, but the villagers stayed back, leaving us in a circle of respectful, terrified silence. We had won the war, and as the echo faded, I realized the survivor's debt had finally been paid in full. Come morning, the bitter hollow was no longer a place of exile. I sat on the porch of the cottage, my human skin healing under the weak winter sun, watching the smoke rise from the chimney. The village hadn't welcomed us with open arms, but they brought bread and they brought grain. That night, the human anchor wasn't a chain anymore. It was the foundation of my home. "You're thinking about them again," Elsie said, stepping out with 2 wooden bowls of stew. In fact, I was thinking about the future. I looked at the tree line and saw 3 massive wolves watching us, not wild ones, but shifters who had sensed the return of a high alpha. They didn't want a king. They wanted a pack that knew how to stay human. My soul answered their call, but my heart stayed on the porch. "I'm thinking about how much I love this soup," I lied, pulling her into my lap. She laughed, a sound that was more beautiful than any howl. Between one breath and the next, I knew the answer to the core emotional question. The monster hadn't been loved back into a man. The man had simply used the love to build a cage for the monster he could live with. Her bones remembered me, and mine remembered her. And just like that, everything changed. I wasn't a biological weapon or a ghost. I was a husband, a neighbor, and a protector. As the mark tingled on my skin, I leaned down and kissed her, the space between us burning with a heat that would never go out. The great beast was gone, replaced by a man who finally knew the way home. Spring arrived in the bitter hollow with a riot of wildflowers and the smell of damp earth. I stood in the garden, my hands caked in soil as I taught a young shifter orphan how to plant rosemary. It was a simple task, a boring human chore, but I did it with the focus of a warrior. Because of Elsie, I knew that the greatest battles weren't fought with claws, but with the quiet act of caring for another. "Is he ready?" Elsie called out from the doorway, her hand resting on her swollen belly. I looked at the boy, then back at the woman who had saved my soul. "He's getting there," I replied, a slow smile spreading across my face. "He just needs to learn that the wood is harder to break than the clay. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was just the magic of a life well lived." As the wind carried her name, I felt the hearth anchor pulse one last time. We were a pack of 2, and soon we would be 3, and the ghosts of the ironwood finally found their peace. The story ended not with a roar, but with a hum, the sound of a kettle, the sound of a home, and the sound of a beast who finally found something worth living for. And she let it happen. The end. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this channel for more werewolf stories.